The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Buckingham Palace as Captain James Morrison adjusted his scarlet uniform for the final time. 23 years he had served the crown, and today would mark either the pinnacle of his duty or its devastating end. The weight of the discovery pressed against his chest like a stone, threatening to crush the breath from his lungs. It had started 3 weeks ago with a routine inventory of the crown jewels. Morrison, as head of palace security, oversaw all such procedures with military precision. The Queen's recent passing had necessitated a complete audit of all royal treasures, a task that fell squarely within his jurisdiction. What they found defied belief and shattered the very foundations of everything he thought he knew about the monarchy. The Koh-i-Noor diamond was missing, not misplaced, not temporarily relocated for cleaning or display purposes, but gone entirely from its secured location. Alongside it, the Black Prince's ruby had vanished, along with 3 pieces from Queen Victoria's personal collection. The total value exceeded £50 million, but the historical significance was immeasurable. Morrison's initial assumption pointed toward an elaborate theft orchestrated by international criminals. The palace's security systems were among the most sophisticated in the world, making such a breach nearly impossible, but not entirely inconceivable. He assembled his most trusted team and began a methodical investigation that would consume every waking moment for the next fortnight. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Sarah Whitmore, a junior member of the household staff, approached Morrison with trembling hands and a manila folder clutched against her chest. She had worked in the private apartments for 8 years, cleaning and maintaining the personal quarters of senior royals. Her reputation for discretion and loyalty was impeccable, which made her revelation all the more shocking. "Captain Morrison," she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder, "I found something that doesn't belong where it is. I wasn't snooping, I swear on my mother's grave. I was simply performing my duties when I noticed something strange in the Queen Consort's private study." The folder contained photographs taken with Sarah's mobile phone, images that would haunt Morrison's dreams for weeks to come. Hidden behind a false panel in an antique writing desk were 3 of the missing pieces: the Black Prince's ruby gleaming like crystallized blood, a diamond brooch that had belonged to Queen Mary, and a sapphire necklace gifted to Queen Elizabeth II on her coronation day. Morrison's hands shook as he examined each photograph. The implications crashed over him like a tsunami. This wasn't a theft perpetrated by outsiders. This was something far more sinister and personally devastating. Someone within the royal family itself had taken these priceless artifacts, and the evidence pointed directly toward Queen Consort Camilla. The captain spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the magnitude of his discovery. His loyalty to the crown ran deeper than blood, passed down through generations of his family, who had served various monarchs with unwavering dedication. His grandfather had died defending King George VI during World War II. His father had devoted 40 years to royal protection services. The Morrison name was synonymous with honor, duty, and absolute discretion. But this transcended personal allegiance. The theft of the crown jewels constituted high treason, a crime that historically carried the death penalty. Even in modern times, it represented an unforgivable violation of the sacred trust between the monarchy and the British people. These jewels belonged not to any individual royal, but to the nation itself, held in perpetuity for future generations. Morrison knew he needed more evidence before making any accusations. Working with Detective Inspector Helen Crawford from Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit, he obtained a warrant to conduct covert surveillance of Camilla's private quarters. Crawford was one of the few people outside the palace who knew the true extent of what had been discovered. The surveillance revealed a pattern of behavior that chilled Morrison to his core. Late at night, when she believed herself unobserved, Camilla would retrieve the stolen items from their hiding place and examine them under lamplight. Security cameras captured her holding each piece with an expression of possessive satisfaction that seemed entirely at odds with her public persona as the dutiful queen consort. But the most damning evidence came in the form of financial records that Crawford's team uncovered through meticulous investigation. Camilla had been quietly selling smaller pieces from her personal jewelry collection through discreet auction houses in Switzerland and Monaco. The proceeds, totaling nearly £2 million over the past 18 months, had been deposited into accounts held by offshore companies registered in the Cayman Islands. The pattern suggested a systematic looting of royal treasures that extended far beyond the crown jewels. Morrison realized with growing horror that Camilla had been using her position to gradually pilfer items from various royal collections, selling what she could, and keeping the most valuable pieces for herself. The Queen's death had provided the perfect opportunity to take the most significant treasures while the palace was in mourning and normal security protocols were disrupted. Armed with this evidence, Morrison faced the most difficult decision of his career. Protocol demanded that he report his findings to King Charles III immediately, but the implications of accusing the king's wife of high treason were staggering. Such a revelation would not only destroy the royal family, but could potentially destabilize the entire British government. The scandal would make the abdication crisis of 1936 look like a minor embarrassment. Morrison arranged a private meeting with Sir Clive Alderton, the king's private secretary, hoping to find guidance on how to proceed. Alderton listened to the evidence with growing alarm, his face paling as the full scope of the situation became clear. The two men sat in stunned silence for several minutes before Alderton spoke. "Captain Morrison," he said slowly, "what you're suggesting could bring down the monarchy itself. Are you absolutely certain of your facts?" Morrison nodded grimly. "Every piece of evidence has been verified multiple times. The photographs, the financial records, the surveillance footage, it all points to the same conclusion. The Queen Consort has been systematically stealing royal treasures and selling them for personal profit." Alderton rubbed his temples wearily. "The king must be informed, but we need to handle this with extreme delicacy. If word of this leaks to the media, the consequences will be catastrophic. We're talking about the complete destruction of public trust in the monarchy." They agreed that Morrison would confront Camilla directly, giving her an opportunity to confess and potentially return the stolen items quietly. If she refused to cooperate, they would have no choice but to involve the king and possibly the authorities. It was a desperate gambit, but they saw no alternative that wouldn't result in complete devastation for the crown. Morrison spent the next day preparing for what he knew would be the most important conversation of his life. He reviewed every piece of evidence, anticipating potential denials and excuses. He practiced his words, trying to find a balance between respect for her position and the gravity of the accusations he would be making. The morning of the confrontation arrived with unseasonable rain pelting against the palace windows. Morrison watched from his office as Camilla went about her normal routine, attending a charity breakfast and meeting with various officials. To all outward appearances, she was the picture of royal dignity, graciously fulfilling her duties as queen consort. But Morrison now saw through the facade. Every smile seemed calculated, every gesture a performance designed to maintain the illusion of propriety while concealing the shocking truth beneath. The woman the British public had come to accept as their queen was nothing more than a common thief who had used her position to line her own pockets with stolen treasures. As afternoon approached, Morrison made his final preparations. He secured copies of all evidence in multiple locations, ensuring that the truth would survive even if something happened to him. He wrote a detailed letter to his wife, explaining the situation and asking her to forgive him for the scandal that was about to engulf their family name. The time had come to confront the queen consort with evidence of her crimes. Morrison straightened his uniform one final time and walked toward Camilla's private study, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. The future of the monarchy itself hung in the balance, dependent entirely on how the next few minutes would unfold. The ancient corridors of Buckingham Palace seemed to whisper warnings as Morrison approached his destination. Portraits of previous monarchs watched from their gilded frames, their painted eyes following his progress with what seemed like silent judgment. The weight of centuries of tradition pressed down upon his shoulders as he prepared to shatter the carefully constructed image of royal perfection that the British people held dear. With each step, Morrison felt the magnitude of what he was about to do. This wasn't simply about stolen jewelry or financial fraud. This was about the very soul of the British monarchy. The crown jewels represented more than mere wealth. They were symbols of national identity, links to a glorious past, and promises of continuity for future generations. Now, all of that was at risk because of one woman's greed and betrayal. Morrison paused outside Camilla's study, taking a deep breath before raising his hand to knock on the ornate wooden door. Whatever happened next would determine not only his own fate, but the future of the 1,000-year-old institution he had sworn to protect. The knock echoed through the mahogany-paneled study with finality that seemed to reverberate through Morrison's very bones. From within came Camilla's cultured voice, tinged with the slight irritation of someone unaccustomed to unexpected interruptions. "Come in," she called, the words carrying the automatic authority of someone born into privilege. Morrison entered the room that had become the epicenter of his investigation. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across Persian rugs and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like guilty secrets. Camilla sat behind an enormous desk that had once belonged to Queen Victoria, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the late hour. She looked up from a stack of correspondence with practiced composure, though something flickered in her eyes when she recognized her visitor. "Captain Morrison," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How unusual to see you in the private apartments. Is there some security matter that requires my attention?" Morrison remained standing at attention, his military bearing concealing the turmoil within. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid there is indeed a matter of utmost gravity that requires immediate discussion. I must ask for your complete discretion regarding what I'm about to share." Camilla's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. The practiced smile faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself, but Morrison caught the flash of something that might have been fear. She gestured toward a chair across from her desk with elegant fingers that bore rings worth more than most people's annual salaries. "Please sit. You look quite serious, Captain. I hope nothing has happened to compromise palace security." Morrison remained standing. "I prefer to stand, Your Majesty. What I have to discuss concerns the recent inventory of the crown jewels and certain discrepancies that have come to light." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Camilla's hands stilled on the papers before her, and for several seconds the only sound was the steady tick of an antique clock on the mantelpiece. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of carefully controlled concern. "Discrepancies? That sounds rather troubling. I assume you're conducting a thorough investigation into any irregularities." "The investigation is complete, Your Majesty." Morrison's voice remained steady despite the hammering of his heart. 3 weeks of intensive work by my most trusted personnel has revealed the location of the missing items. Camilla's composure began to crack like ice under pressure. Her fingers drummed nervously against the desk's leather surface, and she shifted in her chair with the subtle movements of someone fighting the urge to flee. "Missing items? Captain Morrison, I'm not sure I understand what you're implying." Morrison reached into his jacket and withdrew a manila folder identical to the one Sarah Whitmore had brought him weeks earlier. He placed it on the desk between them with deliberate precision, watching as Camilla's gaze fixed on it with the fascination of a bird observing a snake. "Inside this folder, Your Majesty, you'll find photographic evidence of the Black Prince's ruby, Queen Mary's diamond brooch, and Her late Majesty's coronation sapphire necklace. All 3 items are currently hidden behind a false panel in the writing desk approximately 6 feet to your left." The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, and her breathing became shallow and rapid. For a moment, Morrison thought she might deny everything, might summon the righteous indignation that her position entitled her to display. Instead, she slowly opened the folder and examined the photographs with the expression of someone viewing images of her own execution. "I can explain," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "I'm listening, Your Majesty." Camilla closed the folder and leaned back in her chair, suddenly, looking every one of her 76 years. The mask of royal dignity had slipped entirely, revealing a frightened woman who had been caught in an act of unthinkable betrayal. "It started innocently enough," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Charles was always so generous with gifts, but they came with such restrictions. Everything had to be catalogued, insured, displayed at state functions. I felt like a museum curator rather than a wife. I just wanted something that was truly mine, something I could enjoy privately without the weight of protocol and public scrutiny." Morrison listened without interruption as the Queen Consort began her confession. What emerged was a tale of gradual corruption that had spiraled far beyond her original intentions. At first, I only borrowed pieces temporarily. I would take something from the collection for a few days, enjoy wearing it in private, then return it before anyone noticed. It was harmless, really. But then I realized how easy it was to move things around during state visits and official functions. Security was focused on external threats, not on someone with legitimate access to the collections. The confession continued with increasingly damning admissions. Camilla revealed how she had systematically identified pieces that were rarely displayed or checked, items that could disappear for months without detection. She had created detailed records of which items were vulnerable and when they could be safely removed. The financial pressures became overwhelming, she continued, her composure cracking further. Charles is generous, but he has no understanding of what it costs to maintain appearances at my age. The cosmetic procedures, the designer clothing, the gifts I'm expected to give to charity patrons and foreign dignitaries. The allowance barely covered the necessities. Morrison felt a mixture of disgust and pity as he listened to this privileged woman justify theft on the grounds of insufficient luxury. So you began selling royal treasures to fund your lifestyle? Camilla nodded miserably. Only pieces from my personal collection at first, items that had been gifted to me and were technically mine to dispose of. But the amounts raised were insignificant compared to my needs. When I realized how much some of the older royal pieces were worth, the temptation became impossible to resist. She described the elaborate network she had constructed to fence the stolen items. Working through contacts in Switzerland and Monaco, she had sold jewelry piece by piece to private collectors who asked no questions about provenance. The money was laundered through a series of shell companies and eventually deposited in accounts that she controlled completely. The Queen's death provided the perfect opportunity, Camilla admitted with shocking frankness. Everyone was focused on funeral arrangements and succession protocols. Security was disrupted, inventory procedures were suspended, and I had unprecedented access to collections that were normally off-limits. Morrison's jaw tightened as she described how she had used the nation's period of mourning to pillage its most precious treasures. The Koh-i-Noor diamond, Your Majesty. Where is it? Camilla's eyes flickered toward an oil painting on the far wall, a portrait of King Charles II that had hung in that position for 3 centuries. Behind the painting, there's a small safe built into the wall. The combination is the date of my wedding to Charles. Morrison made a mental note while struggling to maintain his composure. And the other missing pieces? Various locations throughout my private apartments. I kept detailed records of everything, locations, insurance values, potential buyers. I'm not a common criminal, Captain. I approached this with the same meticulous planning I bring to all my royal duties. The admission was delivered with such matter-of-fact precision that Morrison momentarily doubted his own sanity. This woman, who had sworn oaths of loyalty to the crown and the British people, spoke of systematically looting national treasures as though discussing menu planning for a state dinner. Your Majesty, do you understand the gravity of what you've admitted? Theft of the crown jewels constitutes high treason. Even in modern times, such crimes carry severe penalties that could include life imprisonment. Camilla's composure finally shattered completely. Tears streamed down her cheeks, carrying expensive makeup with them and revealing the frightened, desperate woman beneath the royal facade. Please, Captain Morrison, I know I've made terrible mistakes, but surely we can resolve this quietly. Charles doesn't need to know, does he? I can return everything immediately. The sold pieces can be recovered. I still have contacts with most of the buyers. Morrison remained unmoved by her tears. Your Majesty, this goes far beyond personal mistakes. You've betrayed the trust of the crown, the government, and the British people. These treasures don't belong to you or even to the royal family. They belong to the nation. But the scandal, Camilla pleaded. Think of what this would do to Charles, to the monarchy itself. The institution would never survive such a revelation. Surely that's worth considering. Morrison had anticipated this argument and had wrestled with its implications for days. The monarchy's survival depends on maintaining the trust and respect of the people, Your Majesty. That trust cannot be preserved through concealing crimes of this magnitude. He walked to the writing desk she had indicated and, with her permission, opened the false panel to reveal the hidden treasures. The Black Prince's ruby gleamed like crystallized blood in the afternoon light, while Queen Mary's diamond brooch sparkled with cold fire. The sight of these priceless artifacts hidden like stolen candy filled Morrison with renewed determination to see justice done. Your Majesty, I'm prepared to offer you one opportunity to minimize the damage, Morrison said as he carefully photographed each item in its hiding place. You will immediately provide me with a complete inventory of every stolen item, including detailed information about pieces already sold and their current whereabouts. You will cooperate fully in recovering sold items and returning them to their rightful place in the royal collections. Camilla nodded eagerly, grasping at this potential lifeline. Yes, of course. I have detailed records of everything. I can provide bank account information, buyer contacts, everything you need. Furthermore, Morrison continued remorselessly, you will accompany me to meet with the king's private secretary within the hour. Sir Clive Alderton will determine how to proceed with informing His Majesty and deciding whether criminal charges will be filed. The mention of Charles knowing about her crimes sent fresh waves of terror across Camilla's features. Please, Captain, isn't there some other way? Charles worships me. This would destroy him utterly. Morrison felt no sympathy for her predicament. Your Majesty, you should have considered those consequences before committing high treason. The time for choosing alternate paths has long since passed. As Camilla began gathering the documents that would detail her elaborate criminal enterprise, Morrison reflected on how completely this investigation had shattered his preconceptions about the royal family. For decades, he had served with unquestioning loyalty, believing in the inherent nobility and honor of the crown. Now he faced the reality that even those born to the highest privileges were capable of the basest crimes. The afternoon sun continued its relentless march across the sky as Camilla assembled evidence of her own guilt. Soon, Morrison would escort her from these opulent rooms to face the consequences of her betrayal. The British monarchy would face its greatest crisis in living memory, and Morrison himself would forever be remembered as the man who brought down a queen consort. But justice demanded nothing less, and Morrison had sworn an oath to serve justice above all other considerations, even when it broke his heart to do so. The walk through the palace corridors towards Sir Clive Alderton's office felt like a funeral march. Camilla moved with the mechanical precision of someone in shock, clutching a leather briefcase containing the documentation of her crimes. Morrison walked slightly behind and, to her right, maintaining proper protocol even as he escorted the queen consort to what amounted to her own trial. Palace staff they encountered along the way bowed respectfully, unaware that they were witnessing history in the making. Footmen, housekeepers, and junior officials went about their duties with the same dedication they had shown for decades, blissfully ignorant that the very foundations of their world were crumbling with each step Camilla took. Morrison observed the familiar tapestries and portraits with new eyes, seeing them not as symbols of continuity and tradition, but as artifacts that might soon be tainted by association with one of the greatest scandals in royal history. Every crown, every scepter, every ceremonial sword displayed in glass cases now seemed to mock the notion of royal honor. Sir Clive Alderton's office occupied a corner of the palace that few outsiders ever saw, a sanctuary where the most sensitive business of the crown was conducted away from public scrutiny. The private secretary had served 3 monarchs over his distinguished career, navigating crises that ranged from political upheavals to family scandals. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what Morrison was about to reveal. Alderton rose from behind his desk as they entered, his refined features betraying the strain of the past few hours since Morrison had first briefed him on the situation. At 68, he possessed the bearing of a career diplomat combined with the discretion that made him invaluable to the royal family. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the late hour, and his dark suit showed no signs of the stress he must have been feeling. Your Majesty, he said with a respectful nod to Camilla, though his eyes remained cold and assessing. Captain Morrison, please take a seat. The office was decorated with understated elegance that spoke of centuries of royal tradition. Original Chippendale furniture, Persian rugs that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, and walls lined with leather-bound volumes that contained the secrets of state dating back to the Georgian era. It was here that decisions affecting millions of lives had been made, where the future of the Commonwealth had been shaped by quiet conversations between trusted advisors. Camilla sat rigidly in her chair, the briefcase balanced on her knees like a shield against the inevitable. Morrison remained standing, his military training keeping him alert despite the emotional exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. The weight of what they were about to discuss seemed to press down upon all three occupants of the room. "Your Majesty," Alderton began with careful formality, "Captain Morrison has briefed me on certain allegations that require immediate clarification. I trust you understand the gravity of this situation and will provide complete honesty in your responses." Camilla nodded mutely, her earlier composure having deserted her entirely during the walk from her study. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I've brought everything. Every document, every photograph, every bank statement." Captain Morrison was quite thorough in his requirements. She opened the briefcase with trembling hands, revealing meticulously organized files that represented years of calculated theft. Morrison watched as Alderton's face grew increasingly grave while examining the evidence. Each document told a story of betrayal that struck at the very heart of the institution they all served. "Sweet Mother of God," Alderton whispered as he reviewed financial statements showing transactions totaling millions of pounds. "Your Majesty, the scope of this, it defies comprehension." The private secretary spent the next hour methodically reviewing every piece of evidence, while Camilla provided a complete confession. She detailed her methods, identified co-conspirators among dealers and collectors, and revealed the locations of items still in her possession. With each admission, the magnitude of the crisis became clearer. "The Koh-Inward diamond alone," Alderton said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Do you understand that this particular gem has been the subject of international diplomatic disputes for generations? Its theft could create a constitutional crisis that extends far beyond our borders." Morrison had not previously considered the international implications, but Alderton's words illuminated new dimensions of catastrophe. India, Pakistan, and Iran all had historical claims to the Koh-i-Noor. If its theft became public knowledge, it could spark diplomatic incidents that would reverberate around the world. "The immediate priority," Alderton continued, "is recovery of all stolen items and assessment of what can be salvaged from this disaster. Your Majesty, you mentioned that several pieces have already been sold. Are you confident that these transactions can be reversed?" Camilla nodded eagerly, desperate to appear cooperative. "Yes, absolutely. Most buyers understand they're dealing in items of questionable provenance. They'll return the pieces rather than face international legal complications. And the financial proceeds? Distributed across multiple accounts, but all recoverable. I can provide complete banking information within hours." Alderton made detailed notes while continuing his interrogation. Morrison was struck by the private secretary's methodical approach, treating this catastrophe with the same professional competence he might apply to routine administrative matters. But beneath his composed exterior, Morrison could see the strain of a man watching his life's work crumble before his eyes. "The next consideration," Alderton said after completing his initial review, "concerns His Majesty the King. Charles must be informed immediately, but the manner of disclosure requires careful consideration." Morrison felt a pang of sympathy for the king, who would soon learn that his beloved wife had betrayed everything he held sacred. "Sir Clive, what is the protocol for such a situation? I've searched our procedures manual extensively, but there's no precedent for anything of this magnitude." "There is no protocol, Captain, because no one imagined such a situation could arise." Alderton's voice carried the weight of someone confronting the unthinkable. "We're entering uncharted territory where every decision we make could determine the survival of the monarchy itself." They discussed various approaches for informing the king, each option fraught with devastating consequences. A full briefing would likely destroy Charles emotionally and possibly prompt him to abdicate in shame. A gradual disclosure might preserve his mental health, but would delay necessary damage control measures. Concealment was impossible given the scope of the evidence and the number of people already involved in the investigation. "There's another consideration," Morrison interjected reluctantly. "Detective Inspector Crawford from Scotland Yard is aware of the basic facts, though not the full extent of what we've discovered today. She'll expect updates on our progress, and her superiors will eventually demand a complete report." Alderton's face darkened further. which means we're operating under severe time constraints. Once the Metropolitan Police become officially involved, we lose all control over the flow of information. The conversation turned to the broader implications for the monarchy's future. Public trust in the royal family had been severely damaged by scandals in previous decades, from marital breakdowns to inappropriate associations with controversial figures. A revelation that the Queen Consort had systematically stolen national treasures would likely prove fatal to the institution's credibility. The media will be merciless, Alderton observed grimly. This story combines everything they love: royal scandal, criminal behavior, and hypocrisy of the highest order. The headlines will write themselves. Morrison imagined the feeding frenzy that would ensue once news broke. Tabloid newspapers would dissect every aspect of Camilla's life, searching for additional evidence of corruption or impropriety. Television networks would run endless analysis programs, featuring experts who would tear apart the monarchy's claims to moral authority. Social media would explode with conspiracy theories and demands for the abolition of the royal system entirely. Your Majesty, Alderton addressed Camilla directly. You mentioned pressure to maintain appearances and financial constraints that motivated your actions. Can you elaborate on these circumstances? If we're to manage this crisis effectively, we need to understand all contributing factors. Camilla straightened slightly, seeming to gather strength from the opportunity to justify her behavior. Charles is wonderfully generous, but he has no understanding of the real costs involved in royal duties. The clothing budget alone is insufficient for someone expected to wear designer gowns to multiple events each week. Then, there are the gifts for foreign dignitaries, charitable donations, personal grooming expenses that can't be charged to official accounts. She described a world of hidden expenses that the public never saw. The cosmetic procedures necessary to maintain a youthful appearance under constant media scrutiny, the private jet flights when official transportation wasn't available, the luxury accommodations required when visiting friends or attending private functions. But surely these expenses pale in comparison to the value of what you stole, Morrison pointed out. It wasn't about the money itself, Camilla replied with surprising passion. It was about having something that was truly mine, something I could control without committees and protocols and endless justifications. Every piece of jewelry Charles gave me came with restrictions: when it could be worn, how it should be stored, which events were appropriate for its display. I felt like a prisoner dressed in someone else's clothes. Morrison found this explanation both pathetic and infuriating. Millions of British citizens struggled with genuine financial hardship, while their queen consort committed treason because she felt insufficiently pampered. The disconnect between Camilla's perceived problems and the reality of ordinary people's lives revealed a level of privilege-induced blindness that bordered on mental illness. The psychological evaluation will be crucial, Alderton mused, apparently thinking along similar lines. If this matter proceeds to trial, the defense will likely argue diminished capacity or some form of kleptomania. We need to be prepared for that possibility. The mention of a trial sent fresh waves of terror across Camilla's features. Surely it won't come to that. If I cooperate fully and return everything, couldn't this be handled administratively? Alderton's expression was grim. Your Majesty, you've admitted to stealing items worth tens of millions of pounds. The Crown Prosecution Service will be under enormous pressure to pursue the maximum penalties available under law. Public opinion will demand nothing less than full accountability. Morrison watched Camilla's growing realization that her privileged position wouldn't protect her from the consequences of her actions. For decades, she had lived in a bubble where problems could be managed discreetly and scandals contained through careful media management. But theft of the crown jewels transcended the palace's ability to control damage through traditional methods. There is one possibility, Alderton said slowly, his tone suggesting he was thinking aloud rather than presenting a firm proposal. If His Majesty were to abdicate in favor of Prince William, it might create enough of a distraction to minimize focus on Your Majesty's situation. The succession would dominate news coverage for months, potentially burying this story. The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Morrison felt sick at the thought of King Charles sacrificing his reign to protect his criminal wife, but he recognized the twisted logic behind Alderton's reasoning. A voluntary abdication might indeed provide cover for quieter resolution of the theft charges. We're getting ahead of ourselves, Morrison said firmly. His Majesty deserves to know the truth before we start planning damage control strategies around his potential abdication. Alderton nodded reluctantly. You're quite right, Captain. The king must be informed tonight, regardless of the personal cost to him or to any of us. As evening shadows lengthened across the palace grounds, the three occupants of Alderton's office prepared for what would likely be the most difficult conversation in the monarchy's modern history. Morrison checked his watch and realized that in less than an hour, King Charles III would learn that his wife was a traitor to the crown he had inherited from his mother. The weight of that approaching moment pressed down upon them all as they made their final preparations for the confrontation that would change everything. The king's private study had witnessed countless moments of historical significance, but none more devastating than the scene that unfolded as Morrison, Alderton, and Camilla entered the oak-paneled sanctuary where Charles III conducted his most sensitive business. Evening light filtered through tall windows that overlooked the palace gardens, casting long shadows across furniture that had served British monarchs for generations. Charles looked up from correspondence he had been reviewing, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to growing alarm as he registered the grave faces of his visitors. At 75, the king carried himself with the dignity that decades of royal training had instilled, but Morrison could see the weariness that had settled upon him since inheriting the throne following his mother's death. Clive, Captain Morrison, Charles said, rising from behind the massive desk that had once belonged to his great-great-grandfather King Edward VII. This is quite unusual. Camilla, darling, you look positively dreadful. Has something happened? Morrison felt his chest tighten as he prepared to shatter this man's world. The king's obvious love and concern for his wife made what was about to unfold even more tragic. Charles had waited decades to marry Camilla, enduring public criticism and personal sacrifice to be with the woman he adored. Learning that she had betrayed everything he held sacred would likely destroy him. Your Majesty, Alderton began with careful formality. We must discuss a matter of utmost gravity concerning the crown jewels and certain irregularities that have been discovered during the recent inventory. Charles frowned, his attention shifting between his wife's obvious distress and his private secretary's grim demeanor. Irregularities? What sort of problems are we talking about? Morrison stepped forward, knowing that delay would only make the revelation more painful. Your Majesty, our investigation has revealed that several pieces from the crown jewels collection have been stolen over the past 18 months. The missing items include the Kohinoor diamond, the Black Prince's ruby, and numerous pieces from Queen Victoria's personal collection. The king's face went pale, but his first concern was for security rather than the personal implications. Good God, how extensive was this breach? Do we know who's responsible? Have the authorities been notified? The silence that followed was deafening. Charles looked from face to face, his confusion deepening as he realized that no one was meeting his eyes directly. When his gaze finally settled on Camilla's tear-stained features, Morrison saw the exact moment when understanding began to dawn. No, Charles whispered, the word barely audible. No, that's impossible. Camilla finally found her voice, though it came out as a broken whisper. Charles, I'm so sorry. I never meant for it to go so far. It started as something harmless, just borrowing pieces for a few days. But then, the king stumbled backward, his legs finding the edge of his chair as though his strength had suddenly abandoned him. Morrison watched a man's entire worldview crumble in real time, seeing Charles's face cycle through disbelief, understanding, and, finally, a grief so profound it was painful to witness. You stole from the crown? Charles asked, his voice hollow with shock. You took the Kohinoor? Camilla, that diamond has been in the crown's possession since Queen Victoria's time. It's not just jewelry. It's a symbol of the empire itself. Camilla approached her husband cautiously, as though he were a wounded animal that might bolt at sudden movement. I know how it sounds, but please let me explain. The pressures, the expenses, the constant scrutiny. I felt like I was drowning. I just wanted something that was mine, something I could control. Control? Charles's voice rose with the first hint of anger. You wanted to control the crown jewels? They don't belong to you, Camilla. They don't belong to me. They belong to the British people, held in trust for future generations. Morrison had remained silent during this exchange, but now felt compelled to provide the full scope of what they had discovered. Your Majesty, the investigation has revealed systematic theft occurring over 18 months, with total value exceeding £50 million. Several items have already been sold through intermediaries in Switzerland and Monaco. Charles turned to stare at Morrison as though he were speaking a foreign language. Sold? You mean they're gone? Lost forever? Not necessarily, Your Majesty, Alderton interjected. Her Majesty has provided complete documentation of all transactions and believes the sold items can be recovered. She's agreed to cooperate fully with recovery efforts. The king's laugh was bitter and devoid of humor. Cooperate fully. How gracious of her to cooperate in recovering the national treasure she stole. He turned back to Camilla with an expression of profound betrayal. How could you do this to me? To the crown? To everything my mother spent 70 years protecting? Camilla's composure finally shattered completely. She fell to her knees beside Charles's chair, clutching at his hands while tears streamed down her face. Please forgive me. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but surely we can fix this quietly. No one else has to know. We can return everything and pretend it never happened. Morrison felt compelled to intervene before false hope took root. Your Majesty, I'm afraid that's not possible. Detective Inspector Crawford from Scotland Yard is already involved, and several palace staff are aware of the investigation. Concealment would constitute obstruction of justice and could implicate everyone in this room in criminal conspiracy. Charles looked at Morrison with the expression of a drowning man being told there were no life preservers available. Criminal conspiracy? Are you suggesting that I could be charged with crimes because of my wife's actions? Not if we handle this properly, Alderton said quickly. But attempts to cover up theft of this magnitude would certainly expose Your Majesty to legal jeopardy. We must proceed carefully and transparently. The king stood abruptly and began pacing the length of his study, his movements sharp and agitated. Morrison had never seen him display such raw emotion, had never witnessed the carefully controlled royal facade crack so completely. Do you understand what this means? Charles demanded, directing his words at Camilla but speaking to the room. This isn't just about stolen jewelry or financial impropriety. This strikes at the very foundation of the monarchy. How can I ask the British people to respect the crown when my own wife has robbed them of their heritage? Morrison realized that Charles grasped the full implications immediately. This wasn't a man who lived in denial or sought easy solutions to complex problems. The king understood that his wife's crimes represented an existential threat to the institution he had inherited from his beloved mother. The media will destroy us, Charles continued, his voice gaining strength as anger replaced shock. Every Republican in Parliament will use this as ammunition to argue for abolition of the monarchy. They'll say we're nothing but thieves and parasites living off the public purse while literally stealing from the people we're supposed to serve. Camilla struggled to her feet, her earlier desperation replaced by something approaching panic. But, Charles, you could pardon me, couldn't you? Surely the king has the power to grant clemency for any crime. The question revealed such a fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional law that Morrison actually winced. Alderton answered with barely controlled exasperation. Your Majesty, the sovereign cannot grant pardons in cases involving crimes against the crown itself. Even if such action were legally possible, it would be political suicide and constitutional crisis. Charles had stopped pacing and now stood at one of the tall windows, staring out at the gardens where tourists gathered daily to photograph the palace where their queen consort had committed treason. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of terrible decisions being made in real time. What are my options, Clive? And please don't sugarcoat the reality of our situation. Alderton consulted notes he had been making throughout the evening. The immediate priority is full recovery of all stolen items and cooperation with law enforcement. Beyond that, Your Majesty faces several painful choices. He outlined scenarios that range from disastrous to catastrophic. Full disclosure would likely trigger demands for Charles's abdication and potentially lead to serious Republican movements. Attempts at concealment would inevitably fail and create even greater scandal when the truth eventually emerged. Criminal prosecution of the Queen Consort would dominate headlines for months, making it impossible for the monarchy to function effectively. There is one possibility we must consider, Alderton said reluctantly. Voluntary abdication in favor of Prince William might provide enough distraction to minimize focus on Her Majesty's situation. William's youth and popularity could help the institution weather this crisis. Charles's laugh was harsh and bitter. So I should sacrifice my reign to protect the woman who betrayed everything I stand for? Abandon the throne my mother entrusted to me because my wife couldn't resist stealing national treasures? Morrison found himself speaking before considering the wisdom of offering opinions to his sovereign. Your Majesty, with respect, the monarchy's survival may depend less on protecting any individual than on demonstrating that the crown stands for justice and accountability, regardless of personal cost. Charles turned from the window to study Morrison with new attention. Are you suggesting I should allow my wife to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, Captain? I'm suggesting that the British people deserve to see that no one is above the law, Your Majesty. Not even royalty. The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the monarchy had traditionally represented. But Morrison meant every syllable. His oath was to protect the crown as an institution, not to shield individual members of the royal family from the consequences of their crimes. Charles nodded slowly, as though Morrison had confirmed something he already knew but hadn't wanted to acknowledge. You're quite right, of course. Justice must be seen to be done, regardless of personal feelings or family loyalties. He turned to face Camilla, who had been listening to this exchange with growing horror. My darling, I'm afraid you'll have to face the full consequences of your actions. I cannot, and will not use my position to protect you from justice. Camilla's scream was raw and desperate. Charles, please. You can't abandon me now. I'm your wife, your queen consort. Doesn't that mean anything? It means everything, Charles replied, his voice heavy with grief. Which is why your betrayal cuts so deeply. You've not only stolen from the crown, you've stolen my ability to trust in the person I love most in this world. Morrison realized that this conversation marked the effective end of Charles and Camilla's marriage, regardless of whether divorce proceedings followed. The king would never again look at his wife without remembering this moment, without seeing the woman who had betrayed his life's work for personal gain. The remainder of the evening was spent making practical arrangements for Camilla's immediate future. She would be moved to a secure location within the palace complex while recovery operations proceeded. Her access to royal jewels and artifacts would be completely eliminated. Most importantly, she would be formally interviewed by Detective Inspector Crawford within 24 hours. I'll need to address the public eventually, Charles said as the meeting drew toward its close. The British people deserve an explanation from their king about what has happened and how we intend to address it. Morrison respected the courage this represented. Many leaders would have tried to minimize their role or shift blame to subordinates. Charles was preparing to accept full responsibility for his wife's crimes and face the consequences with dignity. As the group prepared to separate for what remained of the night, Charles made one final request that surprised everyone present. Captain Morrison, I want you personally to escort Camilla from the palace tomorrow morning. She'll be moved to a secure facility where she can prepare for the legal proceedings ahead. After 23 years of faithful service, this is hardly the assignment you deserved, but I can think of no one I trust more to handle this situation with appropriate discretion. Morrison straightened to attention one final time. It will be an honor to serve your Majesty in whatever capacity is required. As they filed out of the study, Morrison reflected on how completely this investigation had changed everyone involved. The king faced potential abdication and the destruction of his marriage. The monarchy confronted an existential crisis that could end centuries of tradition. And Morrison himself would be forever remembered as the guard who brought down a queen consort. But justice had been served, and sometimes that was the only victory available in a world where even those born to privilege could fall victim to greed and betrayal. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Morrison could rest knowing he had fulfilled his oath to protect the crown, even when it meant exposing those who wore it.